Hi everyone, it's Sherry Vegas here, and in today's tutorial I'm going to be doing a beginner's guide to working with casting epoxy resins and vacuum chambers. So in this video, I'm going to be covering everything you need to know to get started in using vacuum chambers and resin. Now, in this first part, I'm going to be going over the basics of what a vacuum chamber is and the kinds of resins you need, and a little bit of glossary of terms that you need to know. If you already know all of that, feel free to check the timings in the description below and jump ahead. Okay, so first up, what is a vacuum chamber and why would you use it with an epoxy resin? So a vacuum chamber is basically a big pot that seals up nice and airtight, and then when you turn your pump on, it's then going to actually suck out all of that air, and therefore whatever resin you've placed inside is going to suck all of those air bubbles out that you've added in while mixing up your resin. So that's why a lot of artists use it when they are doing any sort of casting projects, because it's going to help reduce and really minimize the amount of bubbles that you get in a resin project. And it's really helpful when you are doing any sort of clear castings, because it's really obvious when those are quite bubbly. So the first thing that you need to know before you go and rush out and buy a vacuum chamber is if it's going to be suitable with the types of resin you are using, or whether you need to change and get the correct resins to work with a vacuum chamber, because not all resins are going to be that suitable, and you're not going to get the benefit from a vacuum chamber if you're using a resin that just isn't compatible. So the first thing you're going to look at is the pot life and the working time. So your pot life with your resin is how long can it stay from when you first mix it up in the pot, and then your working time is from after you've taken it out and you start to pour it, how long do you have to work with it? Now, if you are brand new to working with resin, you might be wondering what the difference is between a pot life and working time, because if it does say on the label it has a working time of 70 minutes, that doesn't mean that you can keep it in the pot for 70 minutes and it would still be fine. And the reason behind that is that resin will overheat the deeper you leave it if you're working with a shallow casting resin. And it's called like an exothermic reaction, and basically it heats up. So if you needed like 200 mils for a project, which is about here, and I'm using a typical normal shallow casting resin, which normally can be poured at like 1 centimeter to 2 centimeters, which is probably about around there. I've now got that sitting at double the depth it's meant to be kept at, and that's going to cause that resin to overheat, accelerate that setting time, and cause that exothermic reaction. So that's why a lot of resins will say the pot lifetime, and that's how long you can keep it in a pot at over the depth it's meant to be at for the period of time that you're mixing it up and getting those bubbles out. And then your working time is obviously when you start to pour it. If you want to do like sort of play around with it, you've got that period of time where it's being brought back down to the correct sort of depth for that particular type of resin. So that's the difference between a pot life and a working time. Now, one way that you can help keep it in the pot for longer is just use a bigger pot, so that way it's not kept at the same depth, because 200 mils is up to there on this one instead of being that deep on that one. So that is one way that you can get around that and keep it in the pot for a little bit longer, but that is the difference. And those are two really important things that you need to look at when you are choosing your resin, because a resin that has a really short pot life and a really short working time, so anything under that 40 to 30 minutes, you're going to really struggle to be able to get the most effective use of your vacuum chamber when you're working with a resin like that, because your vacuum chambers can take anywhere from 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes depending on the resin that you're working with and how bubbly it is. And that if you've only got a pot life or a working time of 30 minutes, then if you've spent 15 to 20 minutes just trying to get those bubbles out, you've got a really short amount of time to work with it. And it would also have already started to get thicker and started to get to that curing process by that stage. So it's just not suitable really for a vacuum chamber. So when you are looking at it, just check your pot life, your working time, and you'll find that most casting resins that you do use generally will have a longer working time to them because it helps release those bubbles out because it doesn't get thick fast. But that is something that is really important to look at before you even get started. And the next really important thing that you need to consider is the cups that you're going to be using in your vacuum pot. So because it does suck up all of those bubbles, it actually will make your resin expand out. And so if you do mix up 200 mils in a cup like this size, you're going to find that that resin's going to expand out and overflow. So you always want to use a cup or a measuring jug that's at least 2 to 3 times bigger than the amount of resin you want to use in your vacuum chamber. So if I was going to do 200 mils in here, this goes up to 600, so this pot should be fine to use. I always just go a lot bigger just to be safe, so that way I'm not going to have it pour all out and go all through my vacuum chamber. So you always need to use a jug or a measuring cup that's a lot bigger than the amount of resin that you are planning on putting into your vacuum chamber. So next up, which kind of projects work best with using a vacuum chamber? So it works best with casting resins. That's why you're going to use it for any sort of resin that you want to pour into a mold, that you're going to be pouring at a decent depth where you can't just pop those bubbles that are on the surface like you could if you were doing just a resin artwork. So this resin artwork behind me, I've used an art resin, and I do not need to use a vacuum chamber for that because I'm just pouring across that top surface area, which means I can just pop those bubbles with either a heat gun or a blowtorch because I'm not pouring that deep at all because I'm just covering that surface. And I don't need a vacuum chamber for that because it's not going deep enough where my heat gun or my blowtorch won't be able to pop those bubbles. But when you do sort of casting projects, you're going to be pouring at like 1 centimeter, 2 centimeters, or even if you do a really deep pour, it's going to be too deep for you to be able to pop the bubbles at the bottom. So that's why you would then go and use a vacuum chamber. So we want to use it for any sort of casting projects. Now, which vacuum chamber should you get? And that honestly depends on what projects you're going to be doing and how many are you going to be doing. If you're brand new and you're getting started and you're doing smaller pieces where you don't need to do a lot of resin in one go, this vacuum chamber is really beginner friendly and it's from Resiners, and all you have to do is plug it in and press a button. I really love this. I use it even though I've got a big vacuum chamber here. If I'm doing any smaller pieces, I will always go for this one just because it's so incredibly simple to use, and I'll show you how to use it in the next section. And then I've got this guy that is obviously I can put a lot more resin in this. I'm not that limited on how much I can do in the one go, but it does require a little bit of setup and a lot more maintenance to keep this running. And it can be a little bit sort of scary to use when you do first get started because you do have to do the controls yourself. It's not just press a button and walk away. And with a machine like this, it does have the 2 separate parts. So I've got my motor that is obviously my air compressor that's going to keep it running. And then you've also got the pressure pot and the chamber. And with this one, it's all in one. I don't have the 2 separate parts that I have to look after. And also with this, I have to make sure that it has the correct amount of oil, and I have to do a little bit more maintenance to keep it running. But with this, I just press and plug it in and press a button, and that's it. So first up, I'm going to show you how you can use the Resiners vacuum chamber. Now this is a really great beginners friendly one. Obviously you need to plug it in. So you plug the power pack in, then on the back you'll see this little toggle, whatever you want to call it, and there's a hole there. You just need to make sure that when you turn it on, that is pushed in. That is your air release hole. So the vacuum chamber will seal up, and that's how it sucks it out. If you leave that off, it's not going to be able to seal up and pressurize, so it's not going to do its job. So you just need to make sure that is on to start with. Now, as soon as you mix your resin up, you want to get it in. You don't want to leave your resin sitting around while you get set up. So I'm going to place the resin in. And you can see my resin is very bubbly, so it's really good. And I've also got it in a cup that's a lot bigger than the amount of resin that I'm using. And I've also made sure that my cup is not going to seal around this part, because when you do place it in, it will go a little bit down. So if you do use sometimes bigger jugs, you can find that that happens. The great thing about this machine is once it has gone for the time, it will automatically switch off, and it will also beep at you. So it's just done that. I'm going to release the air out because you can't actually take the top off when you've still got the pressurized air. And you can see as soon as I release that air out, a lot of those bubbles drop straight down. Now I still do have some bubbles, and I've only done this for 5 minutes. So if I wanted to, I could then put it on again and do another round, because sometimes you do need to go a little bit longer. But you can see here that it started to suck all of those bubbles. So this was all really bubbly, and as it's been sucking, it is pulling them up to the surface. So that's why the bottom of this is really clear now and the top is still quite bubbly. So if I put this on again for another round, it will probably get up most of the rest of those bubbles. And this is what it looks like now that I've taken it out after putting it in for another 5 minutes. And most of those bubbles are now gone. It's looking pretty good. I can always add a little bit of heat just to pop those surface bubbles. But in general, that is looking pretty clear and pretty nice. Now with a vacuum chamber like this, it generally doesn't come set up and you have to attach everything yourself, which honestly is pretty simple to do. So the lid just comes separately and you have to add the first ring on, as well as to the pot you'll get a rubber ring, which you can see here, and then you just need to place those on and make sure that they are around evenly, so that way when you place both rubber rings together, it's going to be able to seal. If you don't have one without the other, it won't be able to seal properly. So that's the easiest step to do. And then you also have to just add this on. So this comes separately, which is pretty simple. Tighten it up, make sure you've got your rubber ring there so it doesn't put too much pressure on this plastic, because you don't want to have it crack. And then you've got your pressure gauge that's already set up. I then connected my pressure gauge to the hose, and then that is then connected to my compressor. So it's not that hard to set up once you kind of know what you need. You've got 2 valves here. So both of these valves are currently sitting in the off position. When I move them across, then this is in the open position. So this will then let that vacuum, this is the vacuum side and this is the fresh air side. I started my compressor up now with both of these in the off position. Nothing's going to happen because it cannot access this. So I need to make sure that once I've started it up, I turn it into the open position so it can start doing its job. If I turn this to the open position, it's just going to start releasing that air back out and nothing's going to happen. The same sort of thing as with the other machine, where you have to make sure that that little toggle on the back is closed. So I want to make sure that that is closed to have it starting. This is your pressure gauge and it lets you see how much pressure you are adding in. The top is clear so that way you can have a look in and make sure nothing's like overflowing. And then you've also got your compressor. So this is the compressor. Through here, you just take this off, and this is where you can add your oil in to run your machine. And that's the minimum amount of oil that's recommended and the maximum amount. So that is pretty simple. I did get some oil that came with this, but obviously I need to go and rebuy. You want to make sure that you get the correct oil. You can't just add any oil in. So it's easier to look for just vacuum pump oil if you're not quite sure. Then I can add my little lid back on, and then plug this in and flick it on, and that will get it started. That part is pretty simple with the setup. So I've just mixed up my resin, and you can see it's quite bubbly. So now I'm going to be using this vacuum chamber. Both my valves are in the off position, and I'm just going to lift the lid up and place my resin in. You can see my container is bigger than the resin, so that way when it does start to bubble up, it's not going to overflow. And then I also like to just put it a bit off center, because when you do release the air back in, I find sometimes that if your resin is directly over that valve, sometimes it can push a little bit of the oil from the pump into that and contaminate your resin. So I always put my resin off center and not directly under my valve. So I just want to make sure that my rubber rings are all on place. Place my lid on top. Then I'm just going to turn my pump on. When my pump is on, I'm going to slowly open up this valve, and I'm still going to keep that one closed. I'm going to be watching my pressure gauge, and I want to make sure it gets the whole way around. If it doesn't rise, it means that this is not sealed properly, or if it only rises a little bit, then I need to just check that I've got all of my settings, everything is correct, because you want to watch it go the whole way around. Now with this, you cannot walk away, you do need to watch it, because it is a lot stronger and it won't automatically switch off. So if you leave it going, you have the possibility of actually breaking your lid. So you want to watch it. Then once it has gone the whole way around and I'm happy and I want to release it, I'm going to move my vacuum chamber valve into the off position, switch my machine off. If I switch my machine off first without closing this, there is the possibility that sometimes it can suck the oil up from the machine and push it into your chamber. So by switching that off, it closes that, and that's not going to happen. And then I'm going to slowly open my fresh air valve. I don't want to just suddenly open it like that because it's going to be too strong. I like to just slowly open it, and then once that is fully open, it will depressurize and I can lift it off. So that was just a bit over 10 minutes, and you can see that's looking pretty good. Like nearly all of the bubbles have gone. And just before, you saw how I released it twice, and then on the third time, bubbles started to rise on the third time, but then they actually started to go down without me turning off my pump. And the reason behind that is I just had less bubbles because I had already had it on for so long, and then they just kept going down with the longer I left it in the pump because more and more bubbles were popping. So I don't think you ever get a 100% bubble-free resin, but it does make a big difference. When it does come to pouring the resin, the worst thing you can do once you've gone through all that process of trying to get rid of those bubbles with a vacuum chamber is to pour it really up high, because that's going to start to incorporate air back into it. So normally I like to either get my mold and pour it on the side, or some people will pour their resin down like their mixing stick, a spatula, anything like that, because that's going to help minimize the bubbles from coming into that resin. But if I was to pour from up here, it's going to create so many more bubbles. So that is something else to consider, is that you use the vacuum chamber as a tool to help you get rid of as many bubbles as possible, but you don't want to then add those bubbles back in if you pour really high, incorporate those air pockets back in, or if you kind of start to mix around with the resin, that's going to start to add the air bubbles back in and take away from using that actual vacuum chamber.